Hi, everyone. So this skills development video will be based on Monkey and the Drought. So later on, you'll see it'll be examples from this lesson plan. And in this week's lesson plan, or in this week's skills development video, we will be explaining the learning outcomes and assessment strategies of a lesson. So I'll show you the parts of the lesson plan for these two sections. So the first one is learning outcomes. So the learning outcomes is what we hope the students will have learned and accomplished by the end of the lesson. So for most of the lessons, the learning outcomes remain about the same. And the standard sentence that is used is students will be able to, and then you list what the students will be able to do. And basically it just means that after the story and the lesson is over, there are certain things that students will have done or will have learned. And it is very important to have these learning outcomes as a teacher because it helps remind you what are some of the key takeaways and what you should make sure you are emphasizing with the students. Okay, so to review them, and those are to just recall the information of the story. So the first one, students should be able to name the characters, the setting, the conflict, and the resolution. And we usually always list the learning outcome. Oh, that's the next one. But yeah, so for the first one, recall just basic information about the story. This helps just to make sure that students were paying attention and listening and practicing the different story components. The next one that we usually always list is that students will be able to think about or act out what they would have done differently. And this one is usually accomplished during the end of story thinking questions and some of the processing activities. And the final learning outcome that is often asked is that students will be able to connect the story to their own life. And this learning outcome is usually accomplished when we do the bridge activity at the beginning and the wondering questions at the end of the story. And I would say this one is probably the most important, the connecting to their own life, because it's the kind of that key link for students to begin adopting more peaceful values and conflict resolution skills in their own lives all the time. So did Sally or Jingo, did you want to add anything for learning outcomes?
One of the activities you can do is if you need a formal assessment in the sense of a demonstration, ask the kids to fold the paper in four and either write or draw the characters, the setting, the problem, and the outcome.
Yeah, so yeah, for this story, Monkey and the Drought, so students would draw for characters, they would draw the monkeys. Setting, they could draw or write turkle in the desert. And then the conflict was about sharing the fruit and the resources. So yeah, so based on that activity and what students draw and write, you'll be able to determine whether or not they've achieved this learning outcome and they can remember this information. So that's a really good idea. All right, and then that kind of segues nicely into the next part, which is assessment strategies. So this section doesn't mean like a test or an exam or anything. Rather, it's more of a tool for teachers to understand whether or not students are kind of understanding the story and the different parts of the lesson. So kind of like what Sally mentioned when they're doing that activity, you can tell by what they draw or write in each of the parts of the story, like the characters and the setting, you'll be able to determine whether or not the students remember and understood the story. And it's important as a teacher to be mindful of how students are responding and reacting to different parts of the lesson, because it will tell you whether or not they need more support if they were on the right track. So for example, if the students don't remember the characters or don't remember the setting, then perhaps you should read the story again, read it slower, read it in a different language. So you want to make sure it will help you to determine if you need to do more practice or if students are ready to move on. So now to review the ones here. So the first standard kind of assessment strategy that I like to use in lesson plans is to watch students and observe students as you're practicing the vocabulary. So by watching all the students as they are saying the vocabulary and observing their body language, you can start to tell who really understands it and who might need more support. And this is important for English language learning because if you only pay attention to the loudest and the best English student, then you'll probably just assume that everyone understands and might forget to provide more support for students who are struggling. So for example, if we're practicing the vocabulary and we have Jingran is yelling so loudly that she knows the answer, monkey, monkey, or fruit, fruit. But Sally is just maybe sitting there quiet, not saying anything, or waiting for Jingran to say something, then I would know that maybe Sally needs a little bit more help and we need to review. And maybe I should speak to Jingran and tell her to quiet down and let the other students share too. So always watch the body language and always scan the room to check all the students to see who's participating and who's not. So another important assessment strategy that I think is a little bit easier than the observation was. Observation of a class takes a bit of practice to get used to, but one that's a little bit easier is to actually just call on all the students and encourage them to participate. So that's the second one. So if one student continues to answer all the questions, then you would only know that the one student understands the content. So again, if Jingran is like, I know the answer, pick me, I know it, I know it. Well, then I know that Jingran knows, but I don't know about everybody else. So if you can call on other students, if you can call on other students who may be a bit more shy or a little bit quieter, then it'll help you to know who's really understanding and who's not understanding. So if you call on a student and they don't know the answer, then you know like they need more support and you may need to go back and read a page in the book again to help them. So if Jingran's the only one who's answering the questions, then I can't tell if Sally or the others know the answer. And perhaps Sally, if she's just a little bit more shy, she can't compete and speak up louder than Jingran. So if I ask someone else, or if I tell Jingran, let's give someone else a try, then you'll be able to start to see whether the other students are also engaging and understanding. And lastly, a key assessment that goes beyond just calling on students to pay attention. Rather than just calling on students like number 2, number 3 is to really pay attention to what they're saying. So 2 and 3 kind of go together. But if the students are responding to questions correctly and in line with the key themes and social emotional concepts of the lesson, then you know they understood the message of the story. And if students are given an answer that are like a bit off, then maybe you know perhaps the student didn't understand what the key message and the lesson of the story was. And so at that point, you might want to go back and read the story again or do some other supporting activities. So these are the 3 ones that I like to use often. Sally, Jingran, do you have anything to add to that?
I would suggest if the children are having difficulty understanding, that before you read the story again, you go back and act out or role play the vocab the vocabulary. Make it a game. Get somebody to define what the word is. You've got pictures, you've got the word, so that supports them. But maybe you can call on some of the quieter ones if you think they can answer with the support of the vocabulary slide.
Yeah, and I just want to say that paying attention to the silent students is really important, why in reality they are often neglected in the classroom. And that's, I think, that the pair share, because the pair share activity is really important, because for some shy and timid students, they might not be willing to share in front of the whole class, but in pairs, they are more active than the teachers think. So teachers, when they observe students, they can also pay attention to how these students act in the pair share in the small groups rather than just in the big class.
Yeah, that's a very good point. In pair shares, you can also be observing and listening to all the students, and they might feel more comfortable in a small group. And it also add too is the independent activities are also really good. So if you have them draw or write about certain things, like for if you do like a sequencing activity, instead of having them answer in a whole class, you can have students just write their sentences or draw a picture about what happens first, next, and last. And that's also a good way to make more students feel comfortable and to assess whether or not they're understanding the story and things like that. So those are some other good ideas. All right. So if there's no other ideas or thoughts about this, that's all we have. But yeah, again, it's just learning outcomes and assessment strategies are really important for teachers. And it's not really a part of like what you're actually teaching to students, but it's important things for you to keep in mind and to be practicing to make sure that the lesson's going well and also to help improve it for next time. So thank you for joining. Thank you, Sally and Jingran. And that is all. Bye.